What dark secrets fueled the rise and fall of the Palaiologos Dynasty, the final rulers of the Byzantine Empire? For 194 years, from 1261 to 1453, this Greek noble family wielded unmatched power, amassing a $500 million fortune through cunning control of trade and taxes. From Michael VIII's daring usurpation to reclaim Constantinople to Constantine X's tragic stand against the Ottomans, their reign was a thrilling saga of triumphs and treachery. Behind the grandeur of the Palaiologan Renaissance, with its dazzling revival of Greek art and philosophy, lie whispered tales of family betrayals, shadowy usurpations, and controversial religious deals that rival the scandals of modern dynasties like the Windsors or Redstones. How did their legacy endure through descendants and Greek nationalism, outlasting fleeting empires? This video peels back the layers of intrigue, exposing the hidden truths of a dynasty that shaped history. Join us to uncover the captivating mysteries of the Palaiologos, a story that will grip history buffs and thrill seekers alike with its blend of power, deception, and enduring influence. From new money to old money. In the vast tapestry of human history, where empires clash and families forge destinies amid chaos, the Palaiologos Dynasty stands out as a remarkable example of ambition, strategy, and resilience. This Byzantine family began with roots in rugged military service on the empire's frontiers and ascended to rule over a restored imperial realm. Their journey from what we might call new money origins, earned through sweat and steel in Anatolia, to the refined status of old money aristocracy-involved conquests, cultural revivals, strategic marriages, thriving trade networks, and internal strife that tested their grip on power. We'll explore this saga step by step, delving into the details that made their story so compelling, from the battlefield foundations to the cultural heights and the dramatic challenges that followed, painting a fuller picture of how one family's determination reshaped an ancient empire while facing relentless trials. We begin with the origins of the Palaiologos family, centered on Nikephoros Palaiologos, the foundational figure who set the dynasty in motion during the 11th century. As a military commander in the Byzantine Empire, Nikephoros held the position of du or governor over the theme of Mesopotamia, a strategic frontier region in eastern Anatolia that served as a bulwark against persistent threats from Arab caliphates and emerging Seljuk Turks. This role placed him right at the edge of the empire's defenses, where the landscape was dotted with rugged mountains, arid plains, and vital trade routes that connected the Byzantine heartland to the volatile eastern borders. It wasn't a glamorous post. It was a harsh, contested zone where the empire's borders were constantly under pressure, demanding not only vigilance and combat prowess to maintain control, but also the ability to manage local populations, levy troops, and administer justice in a region prone to raids and rebellions. The daily life of a du like Nikephoros involved overseeing fortifications, coordinating patrols, and negotiating with neighboring powers, all while ensuring the flow of taxes and resources back to Constantinople. Nikephoros didn't come from ancient nobility with inherited wealth. Instead, his family likely originated from those very Anatolian lands, accumulating their initial fortune through dedicated military service and the acquisition of estates granted as rewards for defending the realm. These estates were more than just land. They included villages, farms, vineyards, and pastures that generated steady income from agriculture, rents, and labor, turning the spoils of successful campaigns into a sustainable economic foundation that could support generations. In this way, their wealth was new money in the truest sense, forged in the fires of frontier warfare, rather than passed down through centuries of aristocratic privilege. In 1078, Nikephoros demonstrated his strategic acumen by aligning himself with Nikephoros III Botaniates in a successful revolt against Emperor Michael VII Ducas, a move that showcased his skills as both a fighter and a political operator amid the empire's turbulent internal politics. This revolt was no minor skirmish. It involved mobilizing armies, securing alliances among disgruntled nobles, and navigating the complex web of loyalties that defined Byzantine court intrigue, where emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency. His involvement in this uprising wasn't just about personal gain. It reflected the era's instability, where military leaders often backed challengers to secure their own positions and expand their influence, hedging against the whims of a weak central authority. By throwing his support behind Botaniates, Nikephoros not only ensured his family's survival, but also positioned them for future advancements, earning titles and additional lands as rewards for his loyalty. Following in his father's footsteps, Nikephoros' son George continued the family's upward trajectory by marrying into the prestigious Ducas family, a union that elevated their social standing and connected them to the imperial elite. The Ducas were one of the empire's most influential clans, with deep ties to the throne and a history of producing emperors and high officials. So this marriage was a calculated step up the social ladder, blending the Palaiologos' military grit with established aristocratic bloodlines. George himself served as Dew of Dyrrhachium, a key coastal theme in the Western Balkans that controlled vital ports and trade links across the Adriatic Sea. Defending against Norman invasions and managing relations with Italian city-states, he held honorable titles such as Curopalates, which denoted high court rank and administrative responsibilities, involving ceremonial duties at the imperial palace and oversight of fiscal matters. These Anatolian estates formed the bedrock of the Palaiologos fortune, not mere plots of land, but vital economic bases that supported their military endeavors and family growth, providing the resources needed to equip soldiers, maintain households, and invest in further alliances. The Palaiologos clan's military hustle in Anatolia involved enduring hardships, endless campaigns, harsh winters, and constant threats. To convert battlefield victories into land grants that built lasting wealth, creating a platform from which they could launch even grander ambitions. The transition from this new money status to established old money prestige didn't happen overnight. It required a blend of audacity, calculated risks, and sometimes ruthless decisions that reshaped the Byzantine landscape in profound ways. The pivotal moment came with Michael VIII Palaiologos, whose imperial usurpation marked a dramatic shift for the family, catapulting them from provincial nobility to the throne itself. Born in 1223 within the Empire of Nicaea, a resilient Byzantine successor state that emerged after the devastating Fourth Crusade sacked Constantinople in 1204, scattering the empire into exile. Michael quickly rose through the ranks as a talented military leader and courtier. Nicaea, centered in western Anatolia, had become a haven for Byzantine refugees, preserving Greek Orthodox traditions and rebuilding military strength under emperors like Theodore I Laskaris, who fortified cities and reformed the army. Michael's early life was shaped by this environment of exile and determination, where survival depended on diplomatic maneuvering and battlefield successes against Latin crusaders and Turkish nomads. He married Theodora Palaiologina, the grandniece of Emperor John III Vatatzes, in a shrewd alliance that bolstered his claims to power and integrated him deeper into the Nicaean aristocracy, providing not only political legitimacy, but also access to influential networks and resources. Theodora herself was a formidable figure, later acting as regent and advisor, embodying the role of women in Byzantine politics. By the mid-1250s, Michael had ascended to the role of Megas Konostalos, commanding the empire's Latin mercenaries, a position that gave him control over crucial foreign troops, often former crusaders hired for their heavy cavalry expertise, and positioned him as a key player in Nicaean politics amid growing tensions with neighboring states like the Despotate of Epirus and the Latin Empire. Following the death of Emperor Theodore II Laskaris in 1258, a scholar emperor known for his intellectual pursuits but plagued by health issues, Michael orchestrated a coup, initially appointing himself as guardian to the young heir, John IV Laskaris, before declaring himself co-emperor in January 1259. This coup involved rallying supporters among the nobility, neutralizing opponents through arrests or exile, and leveraging his military command to ensure loyalty from the troops. That same year, he seized full control of Nicaea, consolidating his power base amid rival factions and external threats, including a decisive victory at the Battle of Pelagonia in 1259 against a coalition of Epirot, Sicilian, and Achaean forces, which shattered Latin influence in Greece and opened the path to Constantinople. The crowning achievement arrived in 1261 when his general Alexios Strategopoulos led a daring nocturnal infiltration of Constantinople, exploiting the Latin Empire's weakened defenses while much of their fleet and army were absent on a campaign against the island of Daphnusia. Strategopoulos, a seasoned commander, used scouts to identify a vulnerable gate, scaling the walls under cover of darkness with a small force that quickly overwhelmed the guards and opened the city to the main army. This surprise attack allowed Byzantine forces to reclaim the city with minimal resistance, ending 57 years of Latin occupation and restoring Greek Orthodox rule, a moment celebrated as a divine miracle in Byzantine chronicles. Michael entered Constantinople in triumph, processing through the streets lined with cheering crowds, before being crowned in the majestic Hagia Sophia, the empire's spiritual heart, in a ceremony rich with symbolism, incense, chants, and the anointing with holy oil to affirm his divine right to rule. In a controversial act to secure his throne, he ordered the blinding and deposition of John IV on the boy's birthday, a brutal measure typical of Byzantine politics to eliminate potential rivals, though it drew widespread condemnation and sowed seeds of future unrest, as it violated oaths of protection and fueled accusations of tyranny. This usurpation wasn't merely a territorial victory. Michael's decisive actions pieced together the fragmented Byzantine territories, Nicaea, Thrace, and Greek islands, elevating the Palaiologos to the pinnacle of old money imperial authority, where their rule was seen as a continuation of Rome's ancient legacy. To solidify this elevated status, the Palaiologos emperors invested heavily in cultural patronage, igniting the Palaiologan Renaissance, a vibrant revival of art, philosophy, and scholarship that illuminated the empire's waning years despite ongoing military and economic pressures. Beginning in the late 13th century and continuing under rulers like Andronicos II, who reigned from 1282 to 1328 and focused on internal reforms, and Manuel II, a philosopher-emperor who traveled Europe seeking aid against the Ottomans. This period saw a deliberate return to classical Greek ideals blended with innovative Byzantine expressions, fostering a cultural boom amid political decline. This Renaissance was not accidental. It was a conscious effort to reclaim the intellectual and artistic heritage of antiquity, countering the empire's territorial shrinkage by emphasizing spiritual and cultural superiority. Artistic advancements included elaborate frescoes that employed perspective techniques to create depth, giving scenes a three-dimensional quality that drew viewers into the narrative. Boneless figure styles, emphasizing fluid, ethereal forms with geometric accents for highlights that conveyed movement and divinity, and a nostalgic nod to the illuminated manuscripts of the 10th century, known for their intricate borders and vibrant colors. Churches across the empire were adorned with intricate narrative cycles depicting biblical stories in vivid detail, such as the mosaics and frescoes in the Cora Church, originally a monastery outside Constantinople's walls, which was rebuilt and lavishly decorated under the patronage of Theodore Medikites, a prominent scholar and statesman who oversaw its transformation between 1316 and 1321. Medikites, serving as Grand Logothete or Prime Minister, poured his personal wealth into the project, commissioning artists to create cycles illustrating the life of Christ, the Virgin, and saints, with innovative compositions that included multi-layered scenes and expressive faces capturing human emotion. These works featured dynamic compositions and emotional expressiveness that pushed Byzantine art forward, blending tradition with subtle Western influences from trade contacts. On the philosophical front, figures like Nikephoros Blemides established schools teaching medicine, rhetoric, and theology, where students learned anatomy from ancient texts, debated Aristotelian logic, and explored mystical theology, creating centers of learning that rivaled medieval universities. Maximus Planudes translated Latin texts into Greek, bridging Eastern and Western intellectual traditions by rendering works like Ovid's Metamorphoses and Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy, facilitating a cross-cultural exchange that enriched Byzantine thought. Gemistos Plethon, based in Mistra, the fortified hilltop city in the Morea that became a cultural bastion, revived Platonism with such fervor that his ideas later influenced the Italian Renaissance, promoting a synthesis of ancient philosophy with Christian thought through treatises on metaphysics and proposals for societal reform inspired by Plato's Republic. Emperors actively supported this resurgence by founding libraries such as Manuel II's Catholicon Musion, a universal academy that drew scholars from across Europe and preserved ancient texts through meticulous copying, with scribes working in scriptoria to produce volumes of Homer, Aristotle, and Ptolemy. The Palaiologos Dynasty's efforts produced enduring masterpieces, including the Deezus mosaic in Hagia Sophia, a grand, late 13th century panel portraying Christ, flanked by the Virgin Mary and John the Baptist, rendered with naturalistic faces that conveyed compassion and authority, profound emotional depth through pleading gestures, and minute tesserae, tiny glass and stone pieces that captured subtle light and shadow effects, making the figures appear almost lifelike under the dome's golden glow. The illuminated manuscripts from Mistra and the Despotate of Morea further exemplified this Renaissance, with scholars in fresco-adorned palaces meticulously transcribing classical texts on vellum, often adorned with gold leaf for shimmering initials, intricate miniatures depicting mythological scenes, and marginal decorations of flora and fauna. Far from superficial embellishment, this patronage was a deliberate assertion of old money legitimacy, demonstrating that the Palaiologos were not only conquerors, but also custodians of enlightenment, weaving cultural threads that sustained Byzantine identity through education, art, and philosophy, even as armies faltered. Strategic marriages played a crucial role in this ascent, forging alliances that enhanced the family's prestige, secured borders, and integrated them into broader networks of power across continents. Early on, the Palaiologos intertwined with the Komnenos dynasty through unions like that of George Palaiologos to Anna Doukaina in the 11th century. Anna was the sister of Empress Irene, directly linking the family to the imperial throne and its storied lineage of warrior emperors who had reformed the empire in the 1080s. This marriage brought not only status but also dowries, political support, and access to court positions, strengthening the Palaiologos' position in the intricate Byzantine aristocracy. Michael VIII proudly incorporated these connections into his full name, Michael Komnenos Doukas, Angelos Palaiologos, highlighting ties to the Angelos family, who had governed from 1885 to 1204 amid Crusader threats, as well as the Doukas and Komnenos lines, all previous imperial houses that added layers of historical legitimacy by evoking the continuity of Roman imperial tradition. Extending beyond Byzantine circles, the family pursued global diplomacy by allying with the Chinggisids, the Mongol descendants of Genghis Khan, whose vast empires, from the Golden Horde in Russia to the Ilkhanate in Persia, posed both threats and opportunities through their control of trade routes and military might. Michael VIII dispatched his illegitimate daughters as brides to key Mongol leaders. Euphrosyne wed Nogai Khan of the Golden Horde in 1270 to ensure stability in the Balkans against nomadic incursions, where Nogai's forces could act as a buffer against Bulgarian and Serbian ambitions, while Maria Palaiologina married Abaka Khan of the Ilkhanate in 1265, fortifying defenses against shared enemies like the Mamluks of Egypt, and fostering trade along Mongol-protected routes that carried silk, spices, and precious metals. These matrimonial pacts, which continued under successors like Andronikos II, who arranged further unions to maintain peace, numbered at least 6 between the Palaiologoi and Chinggisids, blending Byzantine sophistication, courtly etiquette, Orthodox Christianity, with Mongol might, including shamanistic traditions and nomadic warfare, creating hybrid courts where Greek scholars mingled with Persian administrators. The Palaiologos marriages with Komnenos, Angelos, and Chinggisids transformed their family tree into a web of diplomatic strongholds, safeguarding territories through mutual defense pacts and enhancing their old money aura by associating with the world's most powerful rulers. The economic backbone supporting these endeavors was trade wealth, centered on Constantinople's bustling ports that hummed with activity, where information and goods flowed ceaselessly. Upon recapturing the city in 1261, the Palaiologos Dynasty capitalized on its strategic location astride major routes, the crossroads of Europe and Asia, imposing port taxes and monopolizing the lucrative silk trade that originated in China and traversed the Silk Road through Central Asia, involving caravans laden with bolts of fine fabric dyed in imperial purple. Black Sea ports facilitated exchanges with Italian merchants from Genoa and Venice, importing exotic goods like spices from India, furs from Russia, and even slaves from the Caucasus, while exporting Byzantine silks produced in state-controlled workshops, such as those in Thebes, where skilled artisans wove luxurious fabrics under imperial oversight, using techniques passed down from antiquity to create patterns of lions, eagles, and geometric designs favored by European nobility. Michael's 1261 Treaty of Nymphium granted Genoese traders exclusive privileges, including reduced tariffs, dedicated warehouses in the Galata quarter, and trading quarters, which in turn swelled customs revenues through a standard 10% tax on imports and exports, collected by officials who inspected cargoes and issued seals. This system funded military campaigns to reclaim Greek islands, palace restorations that included gilding domes and installing marble floors, and cultural projects like manuscript illumination, sustaining the empire despite territorial losses to Turks in Anatolia. The Palaiologos control over maritime trade arteries, from the Emporium of Trebizond on the Black Sea's eastern shore to Varna in Bulgaria, kept fiscal lifelines open even as Ottoman encroachments loomed, illustrating how economic mastery could buoy a declining power by generating revenues that paid for mercenaries, diplomats, and artists alike. However, perfection eluded them. Religious controversies and civil wars persistently undermined their legitimacy, creating fissures that enemies exploited. Michael VIII's push for union with the Catholic Church at the 1274 Council of Lyon was a desperate diplomatic ploy to avert invasion by Charles of Anjou, the ambitious king of Sicily who claimed Byzantine territories, but it alienated Orthodox faithful who viewed it as heresy, leading to Michael's excommunication by Patriarch Arsenios and derisive labels like Frank for his perceived Western leanings that mocked his submission to the Pope. This sparked the Arsenite Schism, a deep ecclesiastical divide that fractured the Church until 1310, with Arsenites refusing to recognize unionist patriarchs and establishing rival monasteries, compounded by the lingering outrage over John IV's blinding, which branded the dynasty as tyrannical and inspired plots from Laskaris loyalists. Later civil wars exacerbated the turmoil. The conflict between Andronikos II and Andronikos III from 1321 to 1328 involved familial betrayals, where the grandson rebelled against his grandfather with support from young nobles, leading to battles in Thrace and foreign interventions by Bulgarians and Serbs, while the 1341 to 1347 war pitting John V against John VI, Kanta Kouzanos, acquired religious dimensions through the hesychast controversy, where mystical practices of silent prayer divided adherents, hesychasts like Gregory Palamas defending inner stillness against rationalist critics, and drained imperial resources through sieges of Constantinople and alliances with Turks, inviting Ottoman advances into the Balkans as mercenaries turned conquerors. In the same way, Byzantine infighting sapped the Palaiologos' strength, converting potential stability into vulnerability and hastening external threats by weakening armies and dividing loyalties. Turning to their assets, the Palaiologos' fortune encompassed a diverse array of imperial lands, trade infrastructure, cultural treasures, and revenue streams that underpinned their rule for nearly 2 centuries. At the forefront were imperial lands, including opulent palaces in Constantinople like the Blachernae complex, situated in the northwest of the city overlooking the Golden Horn, which Michael VIII restored with expansive halls for audiences, fortified walls incorporating advanced defenses like moats and towers, and ornate decorations of mosaics and silks to symbolize renewed grandeur and host diplomatic receptions. Additionally, vast estates in the Morea, the Peloponnese Peninsula with its olive groves, vineyards, and mountainous terrain, were organized into the Despotate of Morea under Michael's sons like Theodore and Constantine, providing agricultural yields of wheat and wine, tax income from pronoia land grants to soldiers, and military recruits from local Greek and Albanian populations trained in archery and cavalry. Trade assets featured connections to the Silk Road, where overland caravans brought porcelain and jade and Black Sea ports, channeling commodities from distant Trebizond, a semi-independent outpost with its silver mines, to Bulgarian Varna, a hub for grain exports, even as Ottoman pressures mounted in the 14th and 15th centuries with blockades and raids. Cultural holdings gleamed with Hagia Sophia's frescoes, notably the Desis mosaic in the South Gallery, whose lifelike figures of interceding saints and emotional resonance, Christ's serene gaze, Mary's sorrowful plea, influenced subsequent late Byzantine art, embodying spiritual and artistic innovation that drew pilgrims and scholars. The manuscripts of Mistra, produced in monastic scriptoria surrounded by frescoed churches in the Morea like the Parableptos, with its vivid Last Judgment scenes, preserved ancient knowledge through detailed illuminations of geometric patterns and texts of Euclid and Thucydides. Revenues derived from imperial taxes levied on peasants through the Zugarian land tax, and nobles via court fees, alongside tributes from vassal states like Serbia and Bulgaria in the form of golden horses. Michael's aggressive taxation financed reconquests of Aegean islands, though currency debasements under Andronikos II, reducing the gold hyperpyron's purity, signaled growing fiscal strain amid economic challenges from plagues and wars. The Palaiologos assets succumbed to external conquest as relentless Ottoman expansion overwhelmed their defenses. The Ottoman onslaught peaked in 1453 when Sultan Mehmed II's forces, numbering over 80,000 and armed with massive cannons cast by Hungarian engineers like Urban's bombard that hurled 600-pound stones, breached Constantinople's ancient Theodosian walls after a grueling 53-day siege marked by underground mines, naval blockades, and heroic Byzantine resistance with chain booms across the Golden Horn, with Emperor Constantine XI perishing in the fray amid desperate street fighting, clad in common soldier's armor to rally his troops. The Morea Despotate under brothers Thomas and Demetrios, and the Empire of Trebizond, a distant Palaiologos offshoot, followed suit shortly after in 1460 and 1461, respectively, marking the definitive end of Byzantine sovereignty as Ottoman janissaries looted treasures and converted churches into mosques. Yet their cultural legacies persisted. Palaiologan scholars, fleeing westward to Italy with crates of manuscripts, ignited the Renaissance by transmitting Greek classics to humanists in Florence and Venice. Platon's Platonist teachings, delivered at the Council of Ferrara, Florence in 1438, inspired Florentine thinkers like Marsilio Ficino to establish the Platonic Academy, and Byzantine artistic techniques of gold ground and elongated figures shaped masters like Raphael in his Vatican frescoes. Palaiologos patronage sustained Greek learning via enduring manuscripts now in libraries like the Vatican, and frescoes that continue to captivate and educate visitors in Istanbul and the Peloponnese, ensuring the dynasty's intellectual flame burns on. Michael VIII's secret blinding of John IV Laskaris. In the turbulent world of the Byzantine Empire during the 13th century, power was a fragile thing, often seized through cunning and brutality rather than inherited smoothly. Michael VIII Palaiologos stands out as a figure who embodied this ruthless ambition, rising from a general to the founder of a dynasty that would endure for nearly 2 centuries. To understand his actions, we have to go back to the aftermath of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, when Western crusaders, instead of heading to the Holy Land, turned their swords on Constantinople itself. They sacked the great city, shattering the Byzantine Empire into fragments and establishing a Latin empire in its place. The Greek Orthodox rulers fled to various strongholds, with one of the most prominent being the Empire of Nicaea in Asia Minor. There, a line of capable emperors rebuilt their strength, nurturing dreams of reclaiming their ancient capital. The Laskarid dynasty led this revival. Theodore I, Laskaris, founded it, followed by John III, Ducas Vatatzes, who expanded territories and fortified the economy through wise policies, like promoting agriculture and trade. Then came Theodore II Laskaris, a scholarly man with a keen mind for philosophy and theology, but his reign was short-lived. He died in 1258 under mysterious circumstances. Some whispers suggested poison, though nothing was ever proven. His son, John IV Laskaris, ascended the throne at just 7 years old, a mere child in a world of hardened warriors and scheming courtiers. To guide the young emperor, the nobles appointed Michael VIII Palaiologos as regent. Michael was no ordinary noble. He came from an aristocratic family with deep roots in Byzantine politics, and he had proven himself as a skilled military leader in battles against the Latins and other foes. By 1259, Michael's influence had grown so much that he was elevated to co-emperor alongside the boy. But sharing power wasn't in Michael's nature. He craved absolute control, and the presence of John IV, the legitimate heir of the Laskarids, represented a constant threat. The turning point came in 1261, when Michael's forces achieved a stunning victory by reconquering Constantinople. It happened almost by accident. A small scouting party discovered the city lightly defended, as the Latin garrison was away on a campaign. They seized the moment, breaching the walls and forcing the Latin Emperor Baldwin II to flee in disgrace. Constantinople, the jewel of the East, was back under Greek rule after 57 years of Latin occupation. Michael entered the city in triumph on August 15, 1261, processing through the streets amid cheering crowds. He was crowned in the magnificent Hagia Sophia, the cathedral that symbolized Byzantine glory, declaring himself the sole emperor. Yet John IV still lingered as a shadow over his claim. To eliminate that shadow, Michael made a chilling decision. On December 25, 1261, Christmas Day, a holy occasion meant for celebration, and coincidentally John's 11th birthday, Michael ordered the young co-emperor to be blinded. This wasn't an act of random violence. It was a calculated tradition in Byzantine politics. Emperors were seen as God's representatives on earth, and any physical imperfection, like blindness, disqualified them from the throne. Killing a rival outright might invite accusations of murder and provoke divine wrath, but blinding achieved the same result without the stain of bloodshed. The procedure was gruesome, typically involving hot irons or sharp instruments to destroy the eyes, ensuring the victim could never rule again. Michael orchestrated this in secret, at least initially, to prevent immediate scandal. He spread the word that John was safe and well, perhaps retired to a monastery or some distant estate, while in reality the boy was imprisoned in a remote castle on the shores of the Sea of Marmara. John survived the blinding, though the trauma must have been unimaginable for a child. He lived on until around 1305, spending most of his life in confinement. In his later years, he took monastic vows, adopting the name Joasaph, and found some solace in religious contemplation. But his fate sent shockwaves through the empire. When the truth emerged, it ignited fury among those loyal to the Laskarid dynasty, particularly in Nicaea, where the family had built its power base. A revolt erupted there, with locals rising up in defense of the deposed boy emperor. Even the church turned against Michael. Patriarch Arsenius, a staunch supporter of the Laskarids, excommunicated him for the atrocity, refusing to recognize his sole rule. This led to the Arsonite Schism, a deep division within the Orthodox Church that pitted Arsonites, those who upheld John's legitimacy and rejected Michael's actions, against the mainstream hierarchy. The schism festered for decades until around 1310, sapping the empire's spiritual unity at a time when external enemies were pressing hard. Michael tried to justify the blinding as a necessary step for stability. With the empire freshly reunited, he argued, any division in leadership could invite reconquest by the Latins or invasions from other powers like the Mongols or the Seljuk Turks. But deep down, it was a naked power grab, securing the throne for himself and his descendants. His son Andronicus II, who succeeded him in 1282, carried the weight of this sin. In 1290, Andronicus visited the blinded John in his prison monastery, falling to his knees to beg forgiveness. It's said that John, by then an old man shaped by years of suffering, granted it, offering words of reconciliation. Yet the guilt lingered, a dark cloud over the Palaiologos Dynasty that Michael founded. This line would rule Byzantium until its final fall in 1453, but its origins were tainted by this act of betrayal against an innocent child. Shifting our gaze forward by nearly 2 centuries, we find the Byzantine Empire in an even more precarious state, reduced to a few scattered territories amid the rising tide of the Ottoman Turks. By the early 15th century, the once mighty realm was a mere shadow, clinging to survival through diplomacy, alliances, and desperate concessions. This brings us to another shrouded episode, the sale of Thessaloniki to the Ottomans in 1430. Thessaloniki, the empire's second-largest city, was a vital hub of trade, culture, and defense, its ancient walls guarding a population that had endured countless sieges over the centuries. The story ties into John VII Palaiologos, who had served as co-emperor in the late 14th century and navigated the empire through turbulent times by forging uneasy pacts with the Ottomans. John VII's reign was marked by internal strife and external threats. He briefly seized Constantinople in 1390 during a civil war, but his rule was short, and he later reconciled with his uncle Manuel II. Throughout, he dealt directly with the Ottomans, signing treaties that granted them trading privileges and territorial footholds in exchange for peace or support against rivals. Though John VII died in 1408, his approach of pragmatic dealing influenced the Palaiologos family's strategies as the Ottoman noose tightened. By 1422, Sultan Murad II launched a prolonged siege against Thessaloniki, encircling the city with a massive army. The local ruler, despot Andronicus Palaiologos, son of Manuel VII and brother to Emperor John VIII, faced an impossible situation. Andronicus was plagued by illness, suffering from elephantiasis that swelled his limbs and sapped his strength. Inside the walls, the population endured famine as supplies dwindled, leading to riots and despair. People turned against their leaders, some even calling for surrender to end the suffering. In 1423, Andronicus made a fateful choice. He ceded Thessaloniki to the Republic of Venice, hoping their naval power and wealth could defend it better than the weakened Byzantines. This wasn't a straightforward sale for gold, though Venetian aid included military reinforcements and financial support, but a handover for protection. Venice invested heavily, fortifying the defenses and stationing troops, but the Ottoman pressure never relented. Murad II's forces maintained the blockade, using early cannons to batter the walls, digging mines to undermine them, and cutting off all trade routes. The siege dragged on for 8 grueling years, with intermittent assaults and negotiations. By 1430, the Venetians could hold no longer. On March 29th, Ottoman troops stormed the breaches, overwhelming the defenders in a bloody sack. Thousands were massacred in the streets, churches were looted, and around 7,000 inhabitants were enslaved and marched off to distant markets. Amid this chaos, evidence points to a secret deal or negotiations with the Ottomans, perhaps orchestrated quietly to avoid outright betrayal. Whether it was a direct sale or a concealed surrender, the terms were kept hidden to prevent backlash from the Byzantine nobles. These aristocrats, proud of their heritage, would have viewed handing over a Christian city to Muslim conquerors as the ultimate treason, a stain on Byzantine honor. Open knowledge could have sparked rebellions, fracturing the already fragile empire further. Emperor John VIII, overseeing the remnants from Constantinople, had to navigate this delicately, maintaining the facade of resistance while accepting harsh realities. Survival demanded such secrecy. Transparency might have doomed the entire Palaiologos line. This pattern of hidden decisions for self-preservation finds a striking parallel in modern history, with King George V of Britain's refusal to grant asylum to the Romanov family during the Russian Revolution. George V and Tsar Nicholas II were first cousins, sharing an uncanny physical resemblance. They were often mistaken for each other in photographs. When Nicholas abdicated in March 1917, amid the February Revolution, the provisional Russian government sought safe havens for the imperial family. Britain initially extended an offer of asylum, seeing it as a duty to kin, but George V, advised by his private secretary and weighing the political climate, grew fearful. Revolution was brewing in Europe, with anti-monarchist sentiments rising even in Britain. The labor movement and socialists decried the Tsar as a tyrant, and harboring him could ignite unrest, threatening the Windsor throne itself. By April 1917, the offer was quietly revoked. The king shifted blame to Prime Minister David Lloyd George and the cabinet, claiming it was a governmental decision based on logistical issues or public opinion. In truth, royal correspondence reveals George's personal concerns about stability at home. Britain was exhausted from World War I, rationing was in place, and strikes loomed. The Romanovs, desperate and under house arrest, pleaded through letters and diplomats, but no help came. Other nations, like France and Sweden, also refused, citing similar fears. The family was moved to Ekaterinburg, where in July 1918, Bolshevik revolutionaries executed them all: Nicholas, Alexandra, their 5 children, and retainers, in a basement massacre. The secrecy around the asylum refusal allowed George V to preserve his position, but it came at the cost of his cousins' lives, a tragic reminder that rulers often prioritize their own survival over familial bonds. Andronikos, the second secret betrayal of General Alexios Philanthropinos. In the shadowy corridors of Byzantine power, where emperors clutched their crowns with trembling hands and generals rose like stars only to be snuffed out by jealousy, one story stands out as a chilling reminder of how fear can destroy even the mightiest alliances. Picture this: a brilliant commander fresh from crushing Turkish invaders and saving the empire's crumbling frontiers suddenly vanishes into a dungeon, his eyes gouged out on the orders of the very uncle he served. That's the heart-pounding tale of Andronikos II's secret betrayal of General Alexios Philanthropinos in 1295, a hushed act of paranoia that was buried deep to keep imperial control intact, all because the emperor dreaded his general's soaring popularity after those hard-won victories against the Turks. We're talking about a betrayal so calculated it was kept under wraps to avoid sparking widespread outrage or rebellion, ensuring the throne remained unchallenged. In the late 13th century, When the Byzantine Empire was teetering on the edge, its grand legacy as the heir to Rome's glory was hanging by a thread after centuries of relentless assaults. The empire had endured the devastating blow of the Fourth Crusade in 1204, which shattered Constantinople and scattered its territories into fragmented successor states, only to be partially reassembled under the Palaiologos Dynasty. By the time Andronikos II Palaiologos ascended the throne in 1282, following the death of his father, Michael VIII, the realm was a shadow of its former self, battered by crusader legacies, plagued by internal squabbles among scheming nobles, and facing the unrelenting Turkish incursions from the east that threatened to erase Byzantine presence in Anatolia altogether. Andronikos inherited a financial disaster. The treasury was depleted from his father's ambitious reconquests and diplomatic bribes. The army was stretched thin with demoralized troops who hadn't been paid in months. And Anatolia, the empire's vital Asian heartland rich in farmlands, mines, and strategic fortresses, was being systematically carved up by aggressive Turkish beyliks such as Menteşe, Germiyan, and the emerging Osmanlis. These weren't mere bandit raids, they were existential threats with waves of Turkish warriors pouring across the borders, driven westward by the chaotic pressures of Mongol overlords further east, who had disrupted traditional nomadic patterns. These invaders seized key forts like those along the Sangarios River, demanded crippling tributes from terrified Byzantine towns, and turned once thriving communities into desolate ghost shells, where fields lay fallow and trade routes became death traps. The local population, a mix of Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians and Armenian settlers, lived in constant fear, their pleas for help from Constantinople often falling on deaf ears as the capital prioritized European affairs and lavish court expenditures. Andronikos knew he desperately needed a savior to stem this tide in Anatolia, a commander who could rally the fractured forces and push back the encroaching darkness. In a move that blended family loyalty with strategic necessity, he turned to his own kin, his nephew, Alexios Doukas Philanthropinos, a young man born around 1270 into an intricate web of noble bloodlines that wove together some of the empire's most influential families. Alexios wasn't some pampered courtier lounging in silk robes amid the opulent halls of the Blachernae Palace. He came from solid, battle-hardened stock that embodied the Byzantine elite's blend of military prowess and political savvy. His father, Michael Tarchaneiotes, held the prestigious ranks of protovestiarios, overseeing the imperial wardrobe and finances, and megas domestikos, essentially the empire's top military commander under the emperor himself, responsible for drilling troops, planning campaigns, and ensuring the army's loyalty in an era rife with coups. His mother, Maria, came from the Philanthroponoi, a rising family with deep-rooted ties to naval strategy and maritime defense. Her father was a proto-strator, managing the imperial stables and cavalry logistics, and also a megas dou, commanding the fleets that guarded the empire's sea lanes against Venetian rivals and pirate threats. And on his grandmother's side, Martha Palaiologina, the sister of Emperor Michael VIII, which made Alexios a direct blood relative of the ruling Palaiologos Dynasty, granting him and insiders access to the corridors of power, while also placing him under the watchful eyes of potential rivals within the family. This lineage wasn't just names on a family tree. It equipped Alexios with a network of allies, resources, and expectations from a young age, shaping him into a figure destined for greatness or tragedy. He married Theodora Acropolitissa, the granddaughter of the renowned historian and statesman George Acropolites, whose writings chronicled the empire's struggles, and whose family brought intellectual depth and diplomatic acumen to the union. Together they had a son named Michael, who would later follow in his father's footsteps as a general, perpetuating the family's martial tradition amid the empire's ongoing decline. By the early 1290s, Alexios had already begun proving his worth through minor commands and court duties, displaying a keen tactical mind and unyielding loyalty that caught Andronikos' attention. Recognizing the urgent need for a fresh face on the Anatolian front, the emperor thrust him into the fire in 1293, appointing him as due of the Thracian theme, the critical frontier zone in southeastern Anatolia, encompassing vital river valleys and coastal strongholds like Smyrna and Ephesus, with the additional fancy court title of Pinkernes, a high honor that involves serving the emperor's personal wine at banquets, symbolizing trust and proximity to the throne, while also carrying administrative perks like tax exemptions and land grants. Once in command, Alexios hit the ground running, establishing his headquarters at Nymphaeon, a fortified hilltop town that served as a logistical hub with its sturdy walls, granaries, and proximity to key roads leading into Turkish-held lands. He didn't rely solely on local troops, who were often under-equipped and demoralized after years of defeats. Instead, he assembled a diverse force that included Byzantine regulars, drawn from theme-based militias, hardened mercenaries from Catalonia and Alania, who brought exotic fighting styles like heavy crossbow volleys and steppe archery, and even groups of Cretan refugees who'd fled the oppressive Venetian rule on Crete after the island's sale in 1204. These Cretans were particularly tough customers, skilled archers and infantrymen hardened by guerrilla warfare against their former overlords, resettled in Anatolia under earlier imperial policies to bolster border defenses with grants of land in exchange for military service. They formed the core of his mobile strike force, loyal and fierce, though their independent streak would later prove fateful. To handle the northern Neocastra provinces, a rugged area dotted with mountain passes and vulnerable to raids from the Aedan Beylik, Alexios appointed his deputy Libidarios, a capable but ultimately opportunistic officer who managed supply lines and secondary operations. But Alexios himself was the undisputed star, a charismatic leader who inspired confidence through decisive action and personal bravery on the battlefield. Over the course of 1294 and 1295, Alexios unleashed a string of victories that felt like nothing short of a miracle in those bleak, desperate days when Byzantine morale was at rock bottom. His campaign kicked off with a resounding triumph against the Turks of Mysia at the Battle of Acharaios, where he ambushed a large raiding party in the misty valleys near the Sakarya River, using feigned retreats to draw them into kill zones where his Cretan archers and Alan horsemen unleashed devastating volleys, smashing their formations and forcing the survivors to bend the knee, swear oaths of suzerainty to Byzantium, and withdraw from occupied villages. Emboldened, he swept southward along the coastal plains, clearing the Meander River Valley of entrenched raiders who had turned the fertile delta into a no-man's land of burned farms and extorted tolls. Pushing deep into Menteshi territory, a Beylik known for its swift cavalry and hit-and-run tactics, Alexios recaptured the imposing fortress of Melanudian. Its high stone walls and commanding view over the passes had made it a key Turkish stronghold, and the strategic town of Hiron, where he dismantled enemy garrisons and reinstated Byzantine tax collectors to restore imperial revenue streams. He even liberated the ancient port city of Miletus from the burdensome tribute payments exacted by the Turks, breaking their economic stranglehold by negotiating with local merchants, and fortifying the harbors against reprisals, allowing trade ships to dock safely once more, and revitalizing the silk and spice routes that fed Constantinople's markets. As word of these successes spread, Turks fleeing the brutal internal conflicts among Mongol hordes in Persia and Central Asia began defecting to his banner, swelling his army with fresh recruits who brought insider knowledge of enemy tactics and bolstered his ranks with their horsemanship skills. The number of prisoners captured soared so dramatically that, as the scholar Maximus Planudes, Alexios's close friend and correspondent, known for his witty letters and translations of classical works, quipped in one of his epistles, a Muslim captive in the slave markets of Smyrna now cost less than a common sheep, underscoring the sheer scale of the roots. Culminating this streak in the summer of 1295, from his forward base at Tralles, an ancient city with robust Roman-era walls that served as his command center, Alexios repelled a major Turkish assault on the nearby town of Priene, led by the formidable General Karman of the Germian Beylik. Karman's forces, numbering in the thousands with light cavalry and archers, aimed to encircle Priene and cut off its water supply, but Alexios anticipated the move, launching a nighttime counterattack that caught them off guard, inflicting massive losses through ambushes in the olive groves, and reclaiming Huron once more in the aftermath, solidifying his control over the southern frontiers. These wins weren't just tactical battles etched in military ledgers. They were genuine lifelines for the desperate locals who had endured years of unrelenting hardship and neglect under distant imperial rule. Byzantine folks in Anatolia, farmers tilling the wheat fields of the Hermos Valley, artisans in the workshops of Magnesia, and fishermen along the Aegean coast had suffered immensely. High taxes imposed from Constantinople to fund European defenses and courtly extravagances like golden mosaics in Hagia Sophia, while their own homes were torched in annual raids, their livestock stolen, and their children pressed into slavery. Andronikos's policies, including the debasement of the hyperpyron coinage to stretch the treasury, only exacerbated inflation and poverty in the provinces. Alexios changed that dynamic overnight. He not only restored key forts by repairing breached walls and stocking armories, but also halted the raids through proactive patrols, negotiated truces with minor Turkish chieftains to create buffer zones, and distributed captured spoils to local militias, fostering a sense of shared victory and bringing a flicker of hope to communities that had long felt abandoned. His popularity exploded like wildfire across the region. Whispers in tavernas and marketplaces suggested he should be emperor, a man of the people who understood their plight, unlike the aloof rulers in the capital. Monasteries, those bastions of orthodox piety scattered on mountaintops like Athos or in valley cloisters, even began swapping Andronikos's name for Alexios's in their daily prayers, a subtle act of defiance that signaled deep-rooted discontent with the throne. His troops idolized him, viewing him as a paternal figure who shared their hardships, eating the same rations, leading charges from the front, and rewarding bravery with promotions and land allotments. Alexios, aware of the dangerous undercurrents, tried to play it cool. He sent humble dispatches to Andronikos requesting reassignment away from the hot seat of command, perhaps to a quieter post in Thrace or the islands, to diffuse any suspicions of ambition. But the emperor ignored these pleas, his paranoia already stirring. Instead, in mid-1294, Andronikos issued an order for Alexios to hand over control of Lydia, a prosperous sub-region with its silver mines and trade hubs, to Libidarios effectively chipping away at his nephew's command authority and signaling that success had bred envy in the opulent palaces of Constantinople, where courtiers whispered of upstarts threatening the established order. By autumn 1295, the simmering pressure finally boiled over into open conflict, though the exact spark remains murky amid the fog of historical accounts. Hints point to deep-seated grievances over exploitative taxes that drained Anatolian resources to fund distant wars, coupled with Constantinople's blatant indifference to the province's plight, treating it as a mere revenue source rather than a vital limb of the empire. Alexios, pushed by his supporters and perhaps his own frustrations, rebelled. It wasn't a bloodthirsty power grab driven by naked ambition. Rather, it had genuine grassroots backing from folks fed up with absentee rule, including disgruntled landowners, overtaxed peasants, and battle-weary soldiers who saw in him a leader who could deliver real change. At the ancient city of Ephesus, with its grand basilica of St. John and bustling harbor, Alexios made his boldest move yet. He captured Theodore Palaiologos, Andronikos' own brother and a high-ranking courtier, sent perhaps to monitor or undermine him, signaling there was no turning back from this path of defiance. Support surged like a tidal wave. The people of Anatolia, from shepherds in the highlands to merchants in the ports, viewed him not as a usurper but as their protector, a homegrown hero who had bled for their safety. Monks chanted his name in vespers, villagers offered supplies to his camps, and even some Turkish defectors pledged loyalty, seeing stability under his rule. But not everyone jumped on board. Key governors in adjacent themes held back, wary of imperial retribution, and Libidarios, ever the loyalist and tied to Theodore as his father-in-law through marriage alliances, stayed firmly aligned with the throne, plotting from his northern base. Andronikos, panicking in the gilded throne room of Constantinople, where advisors huddled over maps and astrological charts played dirty to regain control. He dangled the prestigious title of Caesar, a huge promotion that placed one second only to the emperor, complete with purple robes, a personal guard, and vast estates to buy precious time and lull Alexios into a false sense of security, making it seem like reconciliation was possible. Negotiations dragged on through envoys, shuttling between the capital and the frontiers, with promises of amnesty and honors exchanged amid tense letters sealed with imperial wax. But behind the scenes, Andronikos plotted with ruthless precision, leveraging family ties and bribes to undermine his nephew. Around Christmas 1295, as snow dusted the Bosphorus and feasts lit up the palaces, Libidarios struck the fatal blow. He secretly bribed a contingent of Alexios' Cretan soldiers, those same fierce fighters who'd been his backbone, enticed perhaps by gold hyperpyra or promises of land back on Crete, to turn traitor in the dead of night. They seized Alexios in his tent, binding him amid shouts of betrayal and on direct orders from the emperor, conveyed through coded messages, blinded him with hot irons, a standard Byzantine punishment for rebels that ensured he could never lead troops again, as sight was deemed essential for command in an era of visual battlefield signals. The revolt collapsed overnight like a house of cards. Without their charismatic leader, supporters scattered, some fleeing to Turkish lands, others surrendering to imperial agents. Alexios was hauled off in chains to a grim prison, perhaps the notorious Animas dungeons in Constantinople's walls, where damp cells and iron bars awaited political foes. His dreams shattered, his eyes gone forever, vanishing from the annals of active history for nearly 3 decades, a living ghost in the empire's underbelly. This betrayal was no accident born of momentary rage. It was a calculated secret, meticulously hushed up to maintain imperial control and prevent the explosive news from igniting more unrest in Anatolia or rippling to the European provinces where discontent already simmered. Andronikos feared Alexios's popularity too much. The general Andronikos feared too much, perceiving not a loyal nephew who had sacrificed for the family, but a potential rival whose adoring masses could rally under his banner and topple the Palaiologos Dynasty in a coup reminiscent of past usurpations. By blinding and imprisoning him, Andronikos silenced the immediate threat, but at what tremendous cost to the empire's future. Alexios's successors proved woefully inadequate. John Tarchaniotes, Andronikos's cousin who stepped in to replace him, focused on administrative reforms like reorganizing tax districts and negotiating truces, but he couldn't replicate the battlefield magic that had turned the tide, lacking Alexios's charisma and tactical genius. Anatolia continued to crumble under renewed Turkish pressure, with beyliks like Karaman and Osman expanding unchecked, capturing cities like Bursa in 1326 and accelerating the loss of Byzantine Asia Minor. The empire paid dearly for discarding its best defender. As resources drained into futile defenses, alliances with Western powers, like the Catalans, turned disastrous with their own rebellions, and the Ottoman shadow grew ever longer, setting the stage for the ultimate fall. John VIII's secret conversion to Catholicism. In the turbulent world of the 15th century Byzantine Empire, a once vast dominion that had dominated the Mediterranean for over a millennium was now teetering on the edge of oblivion, its territories eroded by the relentless advance of the Ottoman Turks. By the 1430s, Constantinople stood as a beleaguered fortress, its formidable walls battered by sieges, and its economy strangled by blockaded trade routes imposed by Sultan Murad II, whose armies had already claimed key strongholds like Thessaloniki in 1430, leaving behind trails of devastation with thousands massacred or dragged into slavery. Amid this existential crisis, Emperor John VIII Palaiologos, who had ascended the throne in 1425 following the death of his father Manuel II, emerged as a figure of pragmatic resolve. Standing tall with a commanding presence accentuated by his flowing beard, a symbol of imperial continuity in the Palaiologos line, John was no naive idealist. He had co-ruled with his father during turbulent times, quelling civil strife against his own brothers and navigating the treacherous waters of diplomacy. Yet behind the facade of imperial grandeur, he grappled with a stark reality. The Byzantine military was a shadow of its former self, depleted by decades of warfare and desertions. The state treasury echoed with emptiness, unable to fund even basic defenses, and deep internal divisions fractured society, with factions clashing over everything from taxation to religious orthodoxy. Recognizing that survival demanded bold action, John cast his gaze westward to the Catholic powers of Europe. Nations like Venice with its mighty fleet, Genoa controlling vital trade, the Papal States wielding spiritual authority, and kingdoms such as Hungary eager for crusading glory. These entities possessed the resources, ships laden with supplies, seasoned soldiers, and overflowing coffers, to potentially orchestrate a grand crusade that could repel the Ottoman tide and breathe new life into the dying empire. However, forging such an alliance came with an insurmountable barrier. The Great Schism of 1054, a cataclysmic rift that had sundered Christianity into the Orthodox East and Catholic West, fostering centuries of animosity rooted in profound doctrinal disputes. At the heart of these disagreements lay issues like the Filioque Clause, an addition to the Nicene Creed asserting that the Holy Spirit proceeds from both the Father and the Son, which the Orthodox viewed as a heretical alteration to ancient tradition. The question of papal supremacy, where the West claimed the Pope as the universal head of the Church, while the East saw him as merely first among equals in a collegial structure of patriarchs. And the concept of purgatory, a state of purification after death accepted in the West, but rejected by the East as unbiblical speculation on the afterlife. These theological chasms were not mere academic debates. They fueled mutual suspicions, with Orthodox faithful decrying Latin innovations as corruptions of pure apostolic teaching, and Catholics dismissing Eastern rites as schismatic obstinacy. John VIII, acutely aware of this divide, understood that any Western aid would require bridging it, even if it meant compromising on sacred ground. This imperative led to the Council of Florence, an ambitious ecumenical assembly summoned by Pope Eugene IV, ostensibly to heal the schism, but for John, a life-or-death diplomatic gambit to secure military salvation. The council commenced in Ferrara in early 1438 only to relocate to Florence on January 10, 1439, after a devastating plague outbreak forced the move to safer quarters. John's participation was no small undertaking. He departed Constantinople in November 1437 aboard a fleet of ships, accompanied by an immense entourage of over 700 individuals, a testament to the gravity of the mission. This delegation included Patriarch Joseph II of Constantinople, a key spiritual leader whose presence lent ecclesiastical weight. Influential bishops like Bessarion of Nicaea, who would later become a cardinal in the West, staunch traditionalists such as Mark of Ephesus, bishop of that ancient see, renowned scholars including the philosopher George Gemistos Plethon, whose Neoplatonic ideas would influence Renaissance thought, a cadre of theologians versed in patristic texts, philosophers debating eternal truths, and even artists tasked with documenting the historic event through sketches and medals, such as the famous bronze portrait of John crafted by Antonio Pisanello, capturing the emperor's resolute gaze and bearded profile in exquisite detail. The journey itself was fraught with peril. Fierce storms tossed the vessels across the Aegean and Adriatic seas, delaying arrivals and testing the resolve of all aboard. Upon reaching Venice in February 1438, the delegation was greeted with pomp and curiosity. John rode triumphantly on a white horse gifted by the Doge, parading through throngs of Venetians who marveled at the exotic splendor of Eastern robes embroidered with gold, jeweled crosses, and icons shimmering in the light, a spectacle that blended awe with the underlying tension of cultural clash. Beneath this veneer of pageantry, the council's proceedings unfolded as grueling marathons of negotiation, stretching over months in opulent halls filled with the haze of incense and the echoes of fervent arguments conducted in Latin and Greek through harried translators. Resuming focused discussions on October 8, 1438, the assembly zeroed in on the most contentious issues. The Filioque Clause dominated early sessions, with Greek delegates drawing from the Cappadocian Fathers, like Basil the Great and Gregory of Nyssa, to argue that the Holy Spirit proceeds solely from the Father, preserving the monarchy of God. Latin theologians countered with references to Augustine and Western creeds, insisting on the dual procession as essential to Trinitarian harmony. Debates raged for weeks, with John intervening personally at key moments, urging compromise not out of theological conviction, but political necessity, reminding his side that doctrinal flexibility could unlock Western armies. Purgatory proved equally divisive. The Orthodox denied any intermediate state after death, viewing the soul's journey as immediate judgment leading to heaven or hell, while Latins explained it as a purifying fire for venial sins, supported by scriptural allusions like 1 Corinthians 3:15 and patristic interpretations. Through exhaustive exchanges, the Greeks eventually yielded, accepting a formulation that described purgatory as cleansing pains without specifying fire, a concession wrung from exhaustion and pressure. Papal supremacy loomed largest, with Eastern bishops resisting the Pope's claim to universal jurisdiction, advocating instead for primus inter pares status. The Latins, rejecting the conciliarist ideas from the rival Council of Basel, emphasized the Pope's infallibility in faith matters and authority over all churches. Here, too, John's mediation tipped the scales, as he prioritized aid over purity, though the decree framed primacy in terms that avoided explicit Eastern submission, focusing on the Pope as head under Christ. Tragedy struck mid-council when Patriarch Joseph II fell ill and died on June 10, 1439, but not before affirming the union on his deathbed, a poignant endorsement that cleared the path forward. His body was buried in Florence with honors, symbolizing the fragile hope of reconciliation. On July 6, 1439, in the majestic Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral, its dome a marvel of Renaissance engineering, the decree of union, Latentur coeli, let the heavens rejoice, was solemnly proclaimed. This bull, rich with biblical imagery praising Christ as the supreme head, declared the end of the schism and outlined the agreed doctrines: acceptance of the filioque, recognition of purgatory, validation of both leavened and unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and affirmation of papal primacy. Artists in John's delegation captured the scene in vivid detail, their works influencing Italian Renaissance masters, like Benozzo Gozzoli, who later depicted the Byzantine procession in frescoes blending Eastern mysticism with Western humanism. Yet John's involvement transcended the public signing. During the council, he privately converted to Catholicism, a deeply personal and concealed commitment that went beyond diplomatic expediency. This was not a grandiose public ritual resounding with bells and choral hymns. Instead, it unfolded in hushed, intimate settings, perhaps during confidential audiences with Pope Eugene IV, in the papal apartments, or through discreet sacramental rites administered away from prying eyes. Historical records, including chronicles from participants like Sylvester Soropoulos, confirmed that John received communion according to the Latin rite, a profound act symbolizing full acceptance of Catholic sacraments and doctrines. Further accounts attest that he maintained this communion until his death in 1448, aligning his soul with Rome, even as his body remained in the East. The motivation for such secrecy was starkly evident. Revelation would unleash cataclysmic backlash from the Orthodox populace, who clung fiercely to their ancestral faith, viewing any Latin influence as a profane betrayal of apostolic purity. Already anti-union sentiments had ignited riots in Constantinople, with monks thundering sermons against the council as a diabolical sellout, and common folk whispering of imperial apostasy. If the emperor's personal flip to Catholicism became known, it could trigger widespread civil unrest, deepen church schisms with figures like Mark of Ephesus, who alone refused to sign the decree, branding it heresy, leading revolts, or even provoke assassination attempts by zealots seeing John as a traitor to orthodoxy. To mitigate this, John shrouded his conversion in layers of ambiguity, portraying the union upon his 1440 return as a mere temporary political pact for crusade support, while privately nurturing his new beliefs through subtle practices. He continued attending Orthodox services at Hagia Sophia, presiding over familiar rituals with incense and chants, all to preserve peace and prevent the empire's fragile unity from shattering. This masterful veil of secrecy finds a compelling echo in the operations of the Trastamara dynasty during the Spanish Inquisition, where religious control was wielded through shadows to forge national cohesion. The House of Trastamara ascended amid chaos in the late 14th century, with Enrique II overthrowing his half-brother Pedro I in 1369 through a civil war marked by intrigue and violence. Enrique's supporters, upon entering Toledo in 1355, unleashed a horrific slaughter of Jews, setting a precedent for using religious purity as a political tool amid factional strife. Under this dynasty, both Castile and Aragon saw royal power eroded by powerful nobles forming conspiratorial alliances, prompting monarchs to reclaim authority through institutional means. By the 1470s, Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile, key Trastamara figures, secured papal approval for the Spanish Inquisition in 1478 via the bull Exigit Sincerae Devotionis Affectus from Pope Sixtus IV, ostensibly to combat crypto-Jews, those who had converted from Judaism under pressure but were suspected of secretly adhering to their old practices. Secrecy was intrinsic to the Inquisition's design, known as El Secreto, encompassing sealed archives that remained inaccessible until the 19th century, anonymous accusations allowing neighbors to denounce without reprisal, and trials conducted in concealed chambers far from public view. Accused heretics endured torture, methods like the rack stretching limbs or waterboarding simulating drowning, in hidden dungeons, their confessions extracted in isolation to prevent leaks or uprisings from converso communities who held economic sway, while public spectacles like the auto da fe, where penitents paraded in sanbenitos, sackcloth garments, before executions by burning, served as deterrent theater. The core processes remained shrouded, enabling arbitrary arrests and asset seizures that funded royal coffers without noble interference. Just as John VIII concealed his conversion to avert Orthodox fury and maintain imperial stability, the Trastamaras veiled Inquisition proceedings to consolidate power, purging perceived threats while projecting a facade of unified Catholic piety, ultimately leading to the 1492 expulsion of Jews and later Moriscos, all in the name of crown survival amid religious and ethnic tensions. Zoe-Sophia Palaiologina's secret Russian alliance, the Byzantine Empire, that 1,000-year-old powerhouse stretching back to the days of Constantine the Great and the glory of Rome, had finally crumbled in 1453 when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II, known as the Conqueror for his relentless ambition, breached Constantinople's mighty Theodosian walls with thunderous cannons forged by Hungarian engineers, their massive stone balls shattering centuries-old defenses as Janissaries, elite infantry converted from Christian boys, swarmed the streets in a frenzy of swords and shouts, looting treasures from Hagia Sophia and turning the city into their new capital, Istanbul. Constantine XI, the last emperor standing defiant in his purple boots, died sword in hand amid the chaos of that fateful May 29th, his body lost in the melee of fallen defenders and advancing foes, leaving no direct heirs on the throne to carry forward the Palaiologos line in power. But his family scattered like leaves in a storm, desperate to survive the empire's collapse, and among them was his niece Zoe Palaiologina, born around 1449 to Thomas Palaiologos, the despot of Morea, and Constantine's younger brother, who ruled that southern Greek peninsula as a semi-independent Byzantine outpost, and his wife Catherine Zacharia, a princess from the Latin Principality of Achaia, whose family had Frankish roots from the Crusader era. Zoe grew up in the shadow of inevitable decline, first amid the rugged landscapes of the Morea, that Peloponnese peninsula with its jagged mountains, olive-strewn valleys, and ancient ruins like Mistra's frescoed palaces, where Byzantine holdouts clung to fading glory through Orthodox liturgies and courtly ceremonies, learning from tutors about her ancestors' imperial heritage, while Turkish scouts probed the borders. Then, as the Ottomans overran even that fragile refuge in 1460, sweeping through with cavalry charges and siege engines that toppled the last Greek fortresses, she fled with her family to the island of Corfu under Venetian protection, its fortified harbors offering temporary sanctuary, before pressing on to papal Rome, the eternal city buzzing with Renaissance energy under popes who saw themselves as successors to Roman Caesars. Her father Thomas, ever the resourceful survivor navigating alliances with Western lords, took his children, Zoe, her brothers Andreas and Manuel, to the safety of papal Rome, where they arrived as exalted refugees, granted pensions and lodgings in the Vatican amidst marble statues and bustling cardinals. There, Cardinal Bessarion, a brilliant Greek scholar from Trebizond who'd converted to Catholicism to bridge East and West, became their guardian, mentoring them in humanist studies and renaming Zoe as Sophia, a nod to divine wisdom from Hagia Sophia and perhaps a symbolic fresh start in the Latin world, helping her adapt to Italian customs while preserving her Greek soul. Life in Rome wasn't easy for the orphan siblings. Thomas died in 1465, exhausted and impoverished after years of exile, leaving the kids as wards of the Pope, educated in elite schools where they studied Latin grammar, Greek philosophy from Plato and Aristotle, and Christian theology blending Orthodox mysticism with Catholic doctrine, all while blending their Byzantine Orthodox roots, icons in their chambers, Easter fasts observed, with the vibrant Renaissance influences of artists like Botticelli and scholars debating ancient texts in sunlit piazzas. Sophia learned courtly manners fit for audiences with kings, theology to argue faith's nuances, and politics to navigate the treacherous alliances of Europe. But deep down, she carried the heavy weight of her uncle's legacy, the Palaiologos name, a symbol of Rome's enduring flame that refused to be extinguished, even as the empire's physical body lay in ruins under Ottoman rule. The chess masters of the Vatican, ever plotting to reclaim influence over the East, soon recognized Sophia's unique value beyond mere charity. Pope Paul II, a shrewd Venetian cardinal elected in 1464, who rose from humble origins to wield papal power with a merchant's cunning, saw Sophia not just as a refugee princess deserving pity, but as a strategic pawn in a grand geopolitical game aimed at uniting Christendom against the advancing Ottomans, and perhaps converting the stubborn Orthodox East to Catholic obedience under Rome's supremacy. In 1469, amid growing fears of Turkish fleets sailing toward Italy, he floated the audacious idea of marrying her to Ivan III, the Grand Prince of Moscow, who'd just lost his first wife, Maria of Tver, in 1467 under suspicious circumstances that some whispered involved poison from court rivals. Ivan was no isolated backwater ruler content with fur trades and wooden Kremlins. He was a visionary consolidator of Russian principalities, methodically absorbing neighbors like Tver and Yaroslavl through marriages, wars, and diplomacy, shaking off the centuries-old Mongol overlords of the Golden Horde after their weakening from internal Khanate feuds and defeats, like the Battle of Kulikovo in 1380, and dreaming big about Moscow's destiny as a sovereign Orthodox powerhouse free from Tatar tributes. The marriage proposal came via a Greek emissary named Yuri Trachaniot, dispatched with letters extolling Sophia's beauty, lineage, and the anti-Turkish alliance it could forge. But it took 3 years of intense haggling over the dowry's size and composition, religious compatibility since Sophia refused Catholic conversion, and political implications like Russian support for papal crusades, before agreement solidified amid exchanged portraits and oaths. Sophia, now in her early 20s and blooming into a poised woman with dark hair and sharp eyes that reflected both Byzantine elegance and Roman resilience, set off from Rome in June 1472 with a massive entourage designed to impress papal legates like the Franciscan Antonio Bonumbre, bearing crosses and indulgences, Byzantine exiles sharing tales of lost Constantinople, Italian artisans skilled in masonry and frescoes, and a dowry of 6,000 gold ducats, plus glittering jewels, rare books from Bessarion's library, including Greek manuscripts of Aristotle and Ptolemy, and holy icons painted with gold leaf depicting the Virgin and saints. Her journey was an epic odyssey fraught with perils, crossing the Apennines on muleback under summer suns, traversing the snowy Alps where avalanches threatened, entering Germany where curious crowds in Nuremberg and Lübeck gawked at the Greek princess in her embroidered gowns, pushing through Poland's vast plains, dodging highway robbers and hostile locals wary of Orthodox heretics, navigating Lithuanian territories tense with border disputes between Moscow and the Grand Duchy, and finally arriving in the Russian border town of Pskov by October, where bells rang and feasts awaited, before pressing on to Moscow in November amid swirling snow flurries that blanketed the wooden city in white. But here's where the secrecy starts creeping in like fog over the Moskva River. Sophia had to navigate her dual identity with utmost care. Raised in Rome and possibly exposed to Catholic rites through Bessarion's influence but remaining deeply Orthodox at heart, she reportedly rejected any pressure to convert, insisting on Greek prayers and crossing herself in the Eastern manner. The marriage on November 12, 1472, in the Dormition Cathedral, a modest wooden structure soon to be rebuilt under her guidance, was a spectacle blending Russian ruggedness with Byzantine splendor. Ivan standing tall in fur-trimmed robes of crimson velvet and a golden crown studded with gems, Sophia veiled in flowing Byzantine finery of silk, damask embroidered with imperial eagles and pearls, rings exchanged amid the chants of bearded priests, and the thick scent of incense wafting from silver censers, with no papal mass or Latin prayers allowed, serving as a subtle snub to Rome's hopes of religious submission and affirming Moscow's independence. But the real bombshell, the secret at the core that pulsed beneath the celebrations, like a hidden heartbeat, was Sophia secretly transferring Byzantine imperial titles to Russia through this union, a clandestine act that elevated Moscow's status without fanfare. As the niece of Constantine XI, she embodied the Palaiologos claim to the imperial throne, the autocrator legacy of Roman emperors that traced back to Augustus, complete with divine right and universal authority over Christians. By marrying Ivan, she didn't just bring a bride to warm his bed and bear heirs. She imported the very aura of Byzantium, the double-headed eagle seal symbolizing dominion over East and West, court rituals like the solemn presentation of the scepter and orb during coronations, and the ideological mantle of Third Rome that positioned Russia as the true guardian of Orthodox faith after the first Rome fell to barbarians and the second to Muslim conquerors. Moscow chroniclers, writing in monastic scriptoria with quills dipping into ink made from oak galls, later spun this as divine providence ordained by God, with Constantinople fallen to infidels who desecrated churches and imposed jizya taxes on Christians. The Orthodox flame passed northward to Russia, where it would burn brighter. Ivan adopted the title Tsar, echoing the Latin Caesar and Greek Kaisar, and styled himself as the protector of the faith, issuing decrees with new seals that subtly incorporated Byzantine motifs without overt proclamations that could alarm spies. Sophia advised on everything from statecraft to aesthetics, rebuilding the Kremlin with the Italian architects she brought along, like Aristotele Fioravanti, who designed the majestic Assumption Cathedral between 1475 and 1479, infusing Russian architecture with Byzantine grandeur through onion-shaped domes that caught the sun like golden orbs, intricate frescoes depicting saints in elongated styles reminiscent of Theophanes the Greek, and mosaics of colored glass that shimmered in candlelight. She influenced diplomacy too, pushing for anti-Ottoman alliances by corresponding with Moldavian and Wallachian princes, fostering ties with other Orthodox realms like Serbia and Georgia through envoys bearing gifts of fur and amber, and encouraging Ivan to position Moscow as the spiritual center for Slavs. Their kids, 8 in total, born in the wooden chambers of the Tarim Palace amid midwives' chants and icon lamps, included Vasily III, who succeeded Ivan after fierce succession struggles, carrying this blended bloodline of Palaiologos nobility and Rurikid princely heritage, cementing a fusion that would define Russian royalty for generations. Why the secrecy that cloaked this transfer like a veil over a sacred relic? This handover was concealed to avoid Ottoman retaliation, a prudent measure in an age when news traveled on horseback and whispers could ignite wars. The sultans, fresh from conquering Byzantium and still consolidating their vast domains from the Balkans to the Middle East, viewed any claim to their spoils as a direct provocation that challenged their legitimacy as caliphs and Caesars of Rome. Mehmed II, with his polyglot court and dreams of reviving Alexander's empire, was expanding aggressively, eyeing the Black Sea coast for naval bases, and even launching a brief invasion of Italy at Otranto in 1480 that sent shockwaves through Europe. His successor Bayezid II continued the push, subduing rebellions and forging alliances with Crimean Tatars who raided Russian steppes. If word leaked that Sophia was handing imperial titles to a northern upstart like Ivan, titles that included claims to Constantinople itself, it could trigger devastating raids on Russian borders by Tatar hordes armed with Ottoman gunpowder, embargoes on vital grain trade through the Bosphorus Straits that fed Mediterranean markets, or even stirring up internal dissent among Moscow's boyars sympathetic to Mongol ties. So, the details stayed hushed in the shadows of the Kremlin. No public proclamations thundered from pulpits, just subtle shifts in Ivan's seals on wax-impressed documents and letters to foreign courts that hinted at elevated status without bold assertions. Sophia's correspondence, personal letters to her brothers Andreas and Manuel, who bounced between Rome's intrigues and Istanbul's opulent Topkapi palace selling their own titular claims for pensions and favors, might contain coded messages about the handover, veiled references to family inheritance, or symbolic gifts like a ring, once worn by Constantine, passed discreetly during Andreas's visit to Moscow in 1480, where he was feted with banquets, but perhaps affirmed the transfer in private audiences. This was no accident of fate, but a deliberate dynastic cover-up, echoing other royal concealments, where survival demanded discretion, like the Windsors masking their German Saxe-Coburg roots during World War I by renaming the house to Windsor in 1917, amid anti-German hysteria that saw dachshunds kicked in London streets and sauerkraut rebranded as Liberty Cabbage, dodging backlash that could topple the monarchy. Sophia's move was plausible secrecy in a dangerous world, factual marriage and title shift documented in annals, but veiled to survive the geopolitical minefield where one wrong word could summon armies. Andreas Palaiologos' secret sale of imperial titles in 1453, when Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II stormed Constantinople, ending an era with cannon fire and conquest. The last emperor, Constantine XI Palaiologos, died fighting on the walls, but his brothers Demetrios and Thomas escaped the carnage. Thomas, the despot of Morea, a chunk of southern Greece still holding out, fled to Italy with his family when the Ottomans overran that too in 1460. He brought along relics like the head of St. Andrew to curry favor with Pope Pius II, who granted him a pension and recognition as titular emperor. Thomas had kids, Zoe, who became Sophia, wife of Ivan III of Russia, Manuel, who later returned to the Ottomans and converted to Islam, and Andreas, born around 1453, right as the empire fell. Andreas grew up in Rome, exiled nobility scraping by on papal handouts, but he inherited the claim to the throne when Thomas died in 1465. As the self-styled despot of Morea and emperor of Constantinople, Andreas lived a life of faded glory, hosting banquets he couldn't afford, racking up debts, and wandering Europe peddling his title like a traveling salesman. By the 1490s, Andreas was broke, his lifestyle catching up fast. He'd married a Roman woman named Caterina, but she died young, leaving him childless and even more isolated. Desperate times called for desperate measures, so in 1494, he struck a deal with Charles VIII of France. Charles, an ambitious king eyeing Italian conquests and dreaming of a new crusade to reclaim Constantinople, saw value in the Byzantine title. It could legitimize his claims in the East and boost his prestige among European rulers. Andreas sold his imperial rights, the claim to be emperor of the Romans, heir to Byzantium, for a pension of 2,000 gold ducats a year, plus some immediate cash to settle debts. The transaction happened quietly in France with documents drawn up to transfer the title, but Andreas kept a clause allowing him to reclaim it if unpaid. Charles paid up initially, using the title to fancy up his court and plan expeditions that never happened. He died in 1498 after hitting his head on a door lintel. Andreas, meanwhile, pocketed the money but didn't stop there. He later tried selling the same rights to Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain in 1502, showing his opportunism. He died in poverty that same year, buried in Rome, his legacy reduced to these shadowy trades. Now, why the big hush? Andreas and his circle kept the sale secret to preserve the Palaiologan prestige, that aura of ancient imperial dignity that still meant something in Renaissance Europe. Admitting you'd hawked the family jewels for cash would tarnish the name, making the Palaiologoi look like beggars instead of exiled royals. It was about maintaining face among nobles, popes, and kings who romanticized Byzantium's past. This mirrors the secrecy around Hanover's George IV and his marriage to Maria Fitzherbert. George, as Prince of Wales, fell hard for Maria in 1784. She was a twice-widowed Catholic beauty, 6 years his senior, with a reputation for virtue. They married secretly on December 15th, 1785, in her London drawing room, officiated by a curate bribed with 500 guineas. But it was illegal under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, which required royal consent for princes under 25, and the Act of Settlement barring Catholics from the throne or marrying heirs. George hid it to avoid losing his succession rights and sparking public outrage. Catholics were still distrusted in Protestant England. He denied the marriage publicly, even as they lived as husband and wife in Brighton Pavilion. But the secret leaked through gossip and debts, forcing George to abandon her for a political marriage to Caroline of Brunswick in 1795. The concealment was all about safeguarding royal prestige and dynasty, just like Andreas bearing his title sail to keep the Palaiologan myth alive. To really flesh this out from a development angle, you dig into French court records from Charles VIII's reign, those dusty archives in Paris holding royal charters, financial ledgers, and diplomatic correspondence that detail the 1494 transaction. Look for the contract specifying the pension terms, 2,000 ducats annually, perhaps paid through bankers like the Medici, with clauses on reversion if Charles didn't deliver. Andreas's own pension agreements, scattered in Vatican or Roman notarial records from his time in Italy, might reveal how he structured the deal, including any witnesses or seals bearing the double-headed eagle of Byzantium. These documents could uncover the exact wording, Andreas transferring all rights, titles, and claims to the Empire of Constantinople, and any side promises, like French support for a crusade or protection for Andreas's family. Comparing this to other dynastic compromises adds depth. Take the Plantagenets princes in the Tower. In 1483, after Edward IV's death, his sons Edward V, 12, and Richard, 9, were lodged in the Tower of London by Uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester. Declared illegitimate due to their father's alleged bigamy, they vanished that summer, presumed murdered to clear Richard's path to the throne as Richard III. The mystery, bones found in 1674 thought to be theirs, but unproven, represents a brutal dynastic wipeout, hidden behind legal fictions, all to secure power amid the Wars of the Roses. Historians debate if Richard ordered it, or if Henry VII killed them after Bosworth in 1485, but it's a classic cover-up of family betrayal for throne stability. Or consider Bush's Brent buyout, referring to George H.W. Bush's oil empire through Zapata Petroleum, co-founded in 1953, which involved covert buyouts and mergers masked as business but tied to CIA operations. Bush acquired interests in Brent oil fields or similar through deals like the 1960s merger with Pennzoil, but more pointedly, his Brent might allude to partnerships or buyouts hidden for political reasons, compromising family dynasty with intelligence ties. Declassified docs show Zapata as a CIA front for ops like Bay of Pigs, with Bush denying links while blending oil profits with spycraft, a modern dynastic compromise where business secrecy preserved political assent, echoing Andreas's title sale shrouded to protect legacy. We can frame this whole thing as the heir who sold Byzantium's legacy, a title that captures the tragedy of Andreas cashing in the remnants of a 1,000-year empire for personal survival. Byzantium wasn't just land, it was a cultural behemoth, heir to Rome, with its art, law, and orthodoxy shaping Europe. Andreas, by selling the title, commodified that heritage, turning symbolic power into coin amid poverty. But it bought him time, living in Rome, perhaps dreaming of restoration while the pension trickled in. Charles used it for propaganda, styling himself as potential liberator of the East, though his Italian wars fizzled. The frame highlights how legacies get traded when empires fall, from Andreas's deal to later claimants like Russian czars invoking Byzantine ties through Sophia Palaiologina.